Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Bruce is a Julius Silver Professorship of Politics at New York University and directs NYU's Center for Conflict Resolution and Multilateral Cooperation. A senior fellow emeritus at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, he has distinguished himself as one of the world's leading authorities on predictive political analytics and game theory applications. Professor Bruce earned his BA from Queens College, New York, followed by his MA and PhD from the University of Michigan. His academic career has been marked by extraordinary recognition, including honorary doctorates from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands and the University of Haifa in Israel, as well as the DMS Peace Prize in Korea. He served as the president of the International Studies Association and is an elected member of both the Council of Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As co-developer of the groundbreaking selectoral theory with Dr. Elseta Smith, Dr. Redolph M. Silverson, and Dr. James Morrow, he has fundamentally reshaped how we understand political survival and leadership behavior. His research spans conflict resolution, complex negotiations, international interactions, and political economy of development, with his game theoretical models being widely used by governments and Fortune 500 companies. His current work examines how political institutions shape domestic instability and the historical trajectories of secularization and economic growth in Europe following the Concordat of Worms. He has authored numerous influential books and works, including The Logic of Political Survival, The Predictioner's Game, The Dictator's Handbook, co-authored with Dr. Alastair Smith, and The Invention of Power. His books have gained widespread acclaim for translating complex analytical frameworks into accessible insights about power dynamics from office politics to international summits. As co-founders of Selectors LLC, a New York-based consulting firm, he has advised the US government and major corporations using sophisticated negotiation models to resolve high-stakes disputes. His uncannily accurate predictions about volatile situations in Iran, Pakistan, and other global hotspots have earned him recognition from the New York Times, The Economist, and the National Academy of Science. In today's episode, Professor Bruce joins us to unpack the central ideas from his acclaimed book, Anticipating Instability, Assessing and Removing Risk Before They Happen. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me welcoming Professor Bruce to the conversation. Professor Bruce, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
It's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you for that very kind invitation. My mother would have believed everything you said.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Professor, the concept of non-events is central to your book. Could you explain how studying what didn't happen actually provides more insights into political change than analyzing coups and revolutions that actually occurred?
Yes, that's a very important question. So imagine that you are the leader of a country. Just as a scholar is interested in predicting when a coup will happen or a revolution will happen or some other event that changes the government, the leader is very interested in anticipating when such a terrible thing from their point of view will happen. And because their life is generally at stake, they're very good at looking for signals that trouble may be brewing. And therefore, they take action to negate the potential threat before we see anything that has happened. Therefore, many people look at changes in the world, changes in government institutions, changes in the mix of corruption and public goods provision and so forth. And they think, well, why did that happen? That just seems not to have been prompted by anything. It's irrational. But the leader is looking at signals and acts on those signals before anything happens. Hence, the non-event, the fact that nothing happened, there was no coup, there was no revolution, is because the leader has made adjustments to prevent that from happening. And in fact, it turns out you can predict much more accurately what kind of changes governments will institute if you look for the signals that the theory says they're looking for, than if there are actual coups or revolutions.
Professor, you develop what you call the coalition loyalty game and the institution change global game as extensions of selectoral theory. How do these new models enable real-time ex-ante predictions about policy changes and institutional modifications that weren't possible with the original framework?
Okay, so let me start by explaining a little bit about the theory because probably most of your audience isn't familiar with it. And you mentioned the Dictator's Handbook. For people who don't want to read a lot of game theory and mathematics, the Dictator's Handbook has no math, no statistics. It would be a good place to start. Anticipating Instability, much more demanding book. So the selector theory starts from some very simple assumptions about politics, or in fact, about any organization. Leaders want to remain in power. Conditional on remaining in power, they want to have as much discretion over how the organization's money is spent. In the original selector theory, in the logic of political survival back in 2003, leaders the book was about what do leaders do to survive. It was not about whether they survive in power or not. It assumed that they survive and that they did so by taking the correct actions. In the work since then, and especially in anticipating instability, there are fundamental changes. First of all, leaders, as in the real world, can lose power. They can see threats and not have sufficient resources to offset the threat. Additionally, in the original work, a leader's so everybody can divide organizations or governments into three parts. The people who have, or four parts, the people who have no say in anything, the disenfranchised, the people who have a nominal say in choosing leaders. For example, in the old Soviet Union, there was adult suffrage. In current day Iran, any citizen 15 years old or older can vote. Then the winning coalition, the people whose support is essential to keep a leader in power, and the leadership, the people who want to stay in power. And leaders just do three things. They raise revenue through taxes and so forth, through foreign aid, whatever. And they spend the money on public goods designed to benefit everybody, healthcare, infrastructure, national security, and so forth, and corruption opportunities, private goods for the members of their winning coalition. In the new theory, we have been able to develop much more subtle implications from those basic conditions. So, for example, I'm going to do a little graph. The size of the winning coalition is moving this way, and how well off each member is moving up this way. So if you're in the winning coalition and it's very tiny, you're getting lots of goodies. But as the coalition gets bigger, two things happen. You water down the private goods, so this begins to drop, reaches a minimum. The leader has to keep spending more revenue because they want to keep you loyal. They don't want you to defect to a rival. So they have to spend more as the coalition gets bigger. And gradually they spend more on public goods because private goods get to be too expensive. The price of those goods is essentially how many people you have to pay off. And so the curve turns up. Now, how quickly the curve turns upward depends on the price of public goods relative to the price of private goods. So if a society is well educated, highly productive, it produces public goods cheaply, this slope is very steep. If the country is less productive, less well educated, the minimum occurs later and the slope is flatter. So this turns out to have very important implications. For instance, most of Western Europe, steep slope. India, democratic country, but the slope is relatively flatter. You notice there is a point at which the winning coalition members in a big coalition are as well off as they could be if the coalition were as small as possible. And if they pass this point, as the coalition gets bigger, they're strictly better off. Below this point, you can make them better off by making the coalition smaller or bigger. Once you pass this point, they can only get better off by making it more accountable, more democratic. When that slope is flatter, as is unfortunately true in India, that cut point happens much, much later. No country, no country, I want to emphasize that word no country that has passed this dividing line has ever stopped being democratic, except if it was conquered by Nazi Germany, with France, the Netherlands, Belgium. And then, of course, as soon as the Nazis were defeated, they went back to being democratic. Once you're past this point, you are invulnerable to coups and revolutions. So leaders up in there behave very differently from those who are looking at this bowl where there are lots of sources of threat. They might, as we show in anticipating instability, if they underpay the coalition, because this line is demarcating what's the right amount to pay to beat a challenger. If you underpay, and you underpay in private goods, that will create pressure to democratize because larger coalition governments, more democratic governments, provide fewer private goods. If you underpay with public goods, you are raising the risk of revolution. And in anticipation that a revolution could happen, members of the winning coalition may contemplate a coup d'etat to save themselves. You might think getting overpaid would be really attractive to people in the coalition, but it's not. If you overpay, there are only two reasons. You made an error because this function is dropping the longer a leader is in office, the less they have to pay. So they may have not caught up to where they should be. So if they're adjusting and catching up, they're fine. But if they're not catching up, then members of the coalition look at that and say, oh, this guy, this leader is contemplating a purge because they can pay this amount to fewer people. And of course, I might be purged, in which case I should launch a coup in anticipation. So the leader can see those risks and make the necessary adjustments. All of that is new in anticipating instability and many other things about learning who you can count on and so forth.
Professor, your book argues that fear of known events does more to redefine how people are governed than actual revolutions. What specific signals do leaders monitor, then alert them to nascent before threats any overt challenge materializes?
So there's, as I said, there's overpayment and underpayment. Those are very important signals because this function is not still. It is dynamic. It is moving. So it's easy to make errors. So leaders are constantly monitoring, am I compensating the coalition of people I need just enough to keep them loyal? If I see I'm giving them too much, I better adjust because otherwise there will be a coup. And if I'm paying them too little, I better adjust upwards, take less for myself, because otherwise the people will revolt or the coalition will launch a coup. I want to prevent those things. Additionally, I have to monitor, and the coalition has to monitor other things. For instance, how much good economic performance should I produce? If I am a new leader, so the old guy, this had dropped dramatically in time. The new guy, it's back up here. So he has to produce a lot of good outcomes. So new leaders produce high growth rates, for example, and journalists look at that and mistakenly think, oh, this guy's a reformer. No, it's just that the function has moved up and it's going to move down with time, and they're going to stop looking like reformers. But in that reform period, they are making an adjustment. They are providing more public goods to avoid the threat of being overthrown. So nothing happens because they have done that. If they fail to do that, they will be overthrown. If a leader is chronically ill, they have heart disease, they have cancer, something that will kill them, or they're very old, their coalition knows that. The coalition is loyal as long as they can count on their leader to keep paying them. So if they suspect that the guy on top is dying, then they are going to be interested in overthrowing that leader, and to avoid being overthrown, so the leader can die in his or her sleep instead of uh, being thrown in a prison cell or shot, the leader makes adjustments. So, for example, they act as if they were new leaders. They increase the growth rate so they can compensate better during the period that they are dying but not yet dead. So it turns out if a leader dies from an acute illness, they get an infection and die a few weeks later. Nobody knew they were going to die. They didn't know they were going to die. The growth rate is much lower than their new guy's growth rate will be. But if they die of a chronic illness, there's no difference in the growth rate between the old guy and the new guy. They've adjusted to prevent people from rising up against them because they see that they are at risk because of their age. Those are a few examples of the things they look for. Are they paying too much? Are they paying too little? Have they become chronically ill? Are they so old that people just don't think they'll live very long? You know, and if you look at some of the dictators of the present and the past, Idi Amin, for example, in Uganda, liked to boast about how good a swimmer he was, how good a boxer he was, and so forth. He wanted people to think, I'm in very good health. Don't think I'm a sickly person. Vladimir Putin goes out in the winter without a shirt on to go hunting to show, see how fit I am. Don't mess with me. I'm not elderly. Robert Mugabe, when he was in his 90s, would dress in a very chic way and talk about how his doctor said he had the bones of a 20-year-old. And he stayed in power until he was 94. He died at 95 because he was making adjustments to the realization on the part of his supporters that he's not going to be around for long.
Professor, the book is unique in combining game theory reasoning with both statistical methods and case studies to test dozens of hypotheses. Could you walk us through an example where this multimodal approach revealed something that either method alone would have missed?
Sure. In 2009, we talk about this at length in the final chapter of the book. Our analyses indicated that several governments in the Middle East were likely to see a change in leaders. The leaders were making incorrect adjustments to the situation that the theory foresaw coming. The situation came in 2011. Journalists looked at the Arab Spring and said that it was caused when Boasiji, a fruit vendor in Tunisia, set himself on fire and killed himself. But I had already given a talk in March of 2010, saying, for example, that Hosni Mubarak would be out of power within a year, within 12 months. And that was based on this 2009 analysis that we had done that said that Egypt's compensation to its coalition was no longer aligned with keeping them loyal, that the situation had changed in a way that was producing significant errors. So, well before anybody saw this coming, the theory had made a prediction. And in the book, what we do is we lay out, I think it's, I forget now, 14 or 18 Middle East countries, and we identified those that, according to the theory, should have adjusted the size of their winning coalition and failed to do so, and those who should have or didn't need to and did the right thing from the theory's point of view, not from a moral point of view. So among those that the theory said had made the correct adjustment, nobody was deposed. Nobody. Among those who made the wrong adjustment, less than half, the theories predicted that they would be out of power. Mubarak out of power in Egypt, Ben Ali out of power in Tunisia, the leader of Yemen out of power, Muammar Gaddafi out of power in Libya. It predicted two others who would be out of power who were not. But they were not because of foreign intervention. It predicted that Bashar al-Assad was making the wrong adjustments and would be in deep trouble. And indeed, he was in deep trouble. A rebellion began, and the military began to defect from him. And so Iran, Iraq, and Russia collectively delivered $5 billion of cash to Assad so that he could buy back the military's loyalty. And in Bahrain, the leader was in deep trouble. People took to the streets, and the Gulf Council countries, led by Saudi Arabia, put troops into Bahrain to save its monarchy. So virtually everybody that the theory said would be in trouble, virtually all of them were, and only the ones that the theory said would be in trouble were the ones who were in trouble and lost power. The theory told us that 2 years in advance. So, of course, if policymakers had been using this logic then, if you were Hosni Mubarak, you could have saved yourself. If you were interested in bringing down their governments, you could have exploited this information. So it could be used and is used by policymakers. How they use it depends on what their particular objectives are, of course.
Professor, when leaders perceive their hold on power is threatened, they must choose between existing policy choices or shifting government accountability. What determines which path they take? And how does this decision ultimately shape whether a society becomes freer or more oppressive?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a moment. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. When leaders perceive their hold on power is threatened, they must choose between existing policy choices or shifting government accountability. What determines which path they take? And how does this decision ultimately shape whether a society becomes freer or more oppressive?
This is a very important question. When a leader perceives that they are at risk, there are essentially, in terms of policy, two moves they can make. They can increase their effort to produce good public policy to buy off the threat, or they can reach inside their winning coalition and their winning coalition's supporters to crush the threat. So if they want to crush the threat, what they have to do is increase their use of private goods, of essentially bribery, to pay people to suppress their opponents. And alternatively, if they decide to become more democratic, they expand public goods. So here is their problem. There are two circumstances under which leaders are absolutely secure as long as they stay healthy. If the coalition is past that dividing line, they're secure. And the other point is if the coalition is really, really small, as in, say, North Korea, if it's really small, there aren't enough what I will call coordination goods, freedoms, free press, free speech, freedom of assembly, for people to coordinate with each other and organize to try to overthrow the government. So if the coalition is sufficiently small, the leader is secure in power. And if it's sufficiently large, they're secure in power. In between, they're in trouble. So depending upon where they are in between and the details of the circumstances that the model identifies, they either try to move to the safe place where people can't coordinate or the safe place where people could coordinate and rebel, but they're getting so many benefits, they're not interested in rebelling. In the latter case, they become more democratic. In the former case, they become more autocratic. From a leader's point of view, if they can do it, it's always better to become more autocratic because then their coalition will be more loyal to them, they'll get paid better, and the leader will be able to steal more money for themselves. The more democratic it is, the less money the leader can steal, and the more the leader has to shift to good public policy, which may benefit society, but doesn't particularly benefit the leader. So most of the time when they believe they face a threat, they try to move in a more autocratic direction. But sometimes, for example, if they're getting close, if they're productive, so this is steep, the coalition is better off moving this way than risking purges and moving this way. If it's flat, that's not true because the gain moving this way is very small compared to the potential gain that way. So if they have, for example, produced a pretty well-educated society, then their adjustment will be gradually to become more democratic. If they have produced a relatively not well-educated society, then their adjustment will tend more towards becoming autocratic. If I may, India's current prime minister has, by the methods that Alistair Smith and I have developed, the same method applied to every country, so we're not picking on anybody, we're just using the same methods. India's winning coalition has diminished. It's gotten smaller. It's gone from being around on a 0 to 1 scale, 0.8, to being around 0.72. Shrinking the coalition is always attractive for leaders. The question, because this is not a steep slope, his coalition is willing to go along with that. And the question is whether for enough people, because India has an enormous middle class, there will be sufficient pushback to stop his disenfranchising voters who are not likely to vote for him and so forth. That, of course, remains to be seen. We did see that in the most recent election. While he won a majority in the Lok Sabha, his percentage of the popular vote was greatly diminished, and his share of seats in the Lok Sabha was greatly diminished. Both signs that people are trying to push back. Because autocracy is great for leaders, but it's never good for the people.
Professor, you have created theoretically grounded, readily estimated means to detect when leaders believe they are at even risk in the absence of actions against their government. How do these early warning indicators translate into practical, anticipatory tools for policymaker or analyst?
So the tools that Alistair Smith and I have developed and the theory we've built, and the earlier versions with Alistair and also with Jim Morrow and Randy Severson, have been used and are being used by some in the United States government because they help to identify when a government can be nudged in a more democratic or a more pro-Western direction and when they can't be. And it helps to do that sufficiently far in advance that you could actually take action to have an effect. And it identifies specific points of change that will be beneficial to the leader in question as well as to the society so that it can be done in a way that is attractive from the perspective of the government being nudged. And from time to time that has in fact been done, not as often as I think it should be done. Government policymakers are not the keenest people to rely on rigorous mathematical logic, but some of them are quite open to it, and when they are, it can have a really big effect, and it has had big effects.
Professor, empirical tests span nearly every country in the world and show strong consistency with even subtle predictions about leadership survival. democratization, and autocratization. Were there any geographical regions or regime types that define your theoretical expectations, and what did those outliers teach you?
So I'm happy to say the answer is no. One of the things that comes out of the results in the tests of the expanded selectorate theory is that uh, subject, of course, to challenges in measurement, empirically, it has worked equally well uh, in every part of the world for every kind of regime. And it has also, we've applied it historically to long ago cases, and it has worked really well there as well. One of the points that we make in the book, in Anticipating Instability, is that as the theory is presented, we have not included in the modeling anything about culture, anything about personality, anything about a country's past history. Everything is, it's like a chess game. What's my next move? Not how did the table get to be where it is. And while we think culture and history and personality are important, uh, we're explaining an awful lot of the distribution of how governments act without any of that. So, for instance, one of the things that we look at is the extent to which governments each year employ torture or extralegal killing. The theory tells us that the variables that should answer the question of how much torture and extralegal killing a government engages in is how big is the winning coalition or how small? Uh, what is the price of public goods? How old or sickly is the leader believed to be? And how long has the leader been in office? I'm going to use a couple of statistical terms and I'll explain them. So, in a statistical analysis of the effect of those variables, including what are called fixed effects, so controlling for the name of every country and the year, uh, most prior research on torture and so forth was explaining about 20% of the variation. The results in Anticipating Instability explain 98%. And that's out of 100%. And if we ignore the fixed effects, we look at just what's called the within variance explanation. That is just what those four variables do. They do over 80%. So the theory is telling us that you can get tremendous leverage in what a government will do by just paying attention to how many people support does it have to stay in power, not how many does it have, how many does it have to have? What's the minimum? How productive is the society? How cheap are public goods? How old or sickly is the leader or healthy? And how long has the leader been in office? New leaders are at much greater risk than older leaders. New leaders produce a lot more public goods and a lot less corruption. The longer they last in office, the fewer the public goods and the greater the ratio of corruption to public goods that they produce. The smaller the coalition, the more corrupt they will be, and therefore the more willing they are to bribe people to go out and bash heads, torture people, and kill people. And the larger the coalition, the less willing people are to do that because the rewards are public goods, not private bribery opportunities. And so they're not willing to do horrible things for the public goods that they get anyway. So it works everywhere. We have applied this theory indeed even to predicting corporate fraud. And it did really well at that as well, sufficiently well that we gave all of the mathematics to the US's Security and Exchange Commission so that they could use the theory to help recognize companies at risk of fraud and help them to make corrections.
Professor, the book addresses variation in economic performance, modernization, and poverty traps through this theoretical lens. How does the anticipation of instability explain why some countries remain trapped in poverty while others break through to sustain development?
So I go back again to this slope and when it's flat. So, from the perspective of a leader, their welfare is strictly decreasing as the coalition gets bigger. But their welfare is decreasing much more slowly when the society has to pay a very high price for public goods, because then it makes it more efficient to stay in power through corruption. So when this is flat, the rate at which a leader's welfare is declining decreases. They're not losing as much as the coalition gets bigger. So they are benefiting from keeping the society unproductive and poor. The members of the winning coalition are barely gaining anything going this way. And although it's risky for them, if it goes this way and they survive a purge, they're going to get a lot. So they are more willing to gamble on becoming autocratic, which means keeping the country poor makes them more loyal to the incumbent leader, more willing to sustain an environment in which they are getting rich through corruption and the rest of society is kept poor. Uh, so it takes difficult political circumstances, and it's a slow process for leaders to shift from here to a steeper slope. First of all, not something that you can do overnight, and it takes facing a political threat that is best responded to by producing more public goods. And those are relatively infrequent. So poverty traps are not the consequence of bad climate. They're not the consequence of bad luck. I might add, they're not the consequence of colonialism. They are the consequence of being a method by which a leader in power can improve the chances of staying in power, and the leader's coalition of key supporters can benefit by keeping that person in power and getting fat and rich while everybody else is starving and poor. You know, if you look at pictures of the top generals and so forth in North Korea, or of Kim Jong-un for that matter, they are indeed fat and rich. And the people are miserably poor. But it's working really well for the Kim family. North Korea, since the end of World War II, so we're talking now 80 years, has had three leaders. Uh, India, a much more democratic country, had Nehru, Shastri, a series of Gandhis, Bajpai, Mohan. You've had a lot of prime ministers. A lot of democratic countries, not good for leaders. They get turned out of office. Autocracy, great for leaders, and great for the coalition members because they're the ones getting rich. So they induce poverty. It's good for them. Now, there are circumstances in which governments become so impoverished that improved freedom and democracy is the only solution. I give by way of example, we talk at length in the last chapter of Anticipating Instability about not a country very many people outside of Sierra Leone pay attention to. Sierra Leone was a miserable petty dictatorship, an extremely poor country, very, very low per capita income, riven by coups, rebellion, and so forth for many years. The government so impoverished the society that even the minimal, what I will call material public goods that are necessary for a society to function, basic elementary education, they couldn't afford it. And so they have to use game theory term, in equilibrium, they have to produce some public goods. They couldn't afford even minimal education. They couldn't afford to build roads and so forth. So they could do something that does not cost money. They could allow people more freedom. It is free to let people say what they want. It is free to let the newspapers write what they want. It is costly to repress them. So Sierra Leone began to increase freedoms as a way to provide the public goods they couldn't buy, like infrastructure. And the result of that increased freedom was the demand for public goods accelerated and forced the leaders, very flat here, forced them to increase the coalition. So today, Sierra Leone's coalition, not quite as large as India's in terms of proportion, but getting there, getting close. It's become a much more democratic society because their only solution to staying in power was to add freedom.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Given that your model offers the potential for reliable predictions about when government will change policies or institutions to preempt challenges, how should international actors, whether governments, NGO, or businesses, use these insights ethically and effectively without inadvertently destabilizing the very situations they are trying to understand?
So this is a difficult question. It's not difficult in terms of the theory's logic. It's difficult in terms of what is the right thing for governments to do because many people will be uncomfortable with the answer. So, for example, it has been common to provide loan forgiveness or loan relief to countries, for instance, in autocratic countries in Africa that had such a heavy debt overhang that they couldn't develop because all the money was going to servicing their debt. A failure of well-intentioned politicians and organizations like the World Bank and NGOs in this circumstance is to think, well, if we lift the debt problem, these countries will do better because they're working on the assumption that it's an economic problem, not a political problem. But the debt problem is a political problem. That is, the government had accumulated so much debt that the leader could no longer borrow money in the international markets with which to bribe his or her cronies to stay in power. So lifting the debt sustains the dictator in power. It relieves their problem. And if you follow the data, as we do in the second edition of the Dictator's Handbook, we have a detailed chapter on this question. The consequence of lifting debt is a few years later, these countries have the same level of debt because the debt is good for autocratic leaders and its relief helps them to survive. So we shouldn't relieve that debt. We should push the government into a situation where, as with Sierra Leone, it can't afford corruption, and so it has to introduce more freedom and more growth. Foreign aid. Alistair Smith and I have written quite a few papers on foreign aid and have advised U.S. government in the past, not the current administration, and also the United Nations Development Fund on how foreign aid actually works. The logic of foreign aid is really very straightforward. Foreign aid is not given to alleviate need. Foreign aid is given to buy policy concessions. The job of a democratic leader is to get reelected or to get his or her party reelected. And that means at the margin, finding policies that will satisfy their constituents. And again, at the margin, that involves foreign policies, getting foreign governments to provide more security concessions, military bases, intelligence, what have you, or to provide more favorable trade relations. How is that achieved? You are a dictator. You need money to bribe your coalition. You're a Democrat, it's much more expensive, so very few democracies get aid. If you're a dictator, you don't need money to help the people. You need money to keep your coalition loyal. I will give you that money as foreign aid, and in return, you will give me policy concessions. So government dictators that get average per capita foreign aid have a 32% higher probability of remaining in power the next year than if they didn't get the aid. So aid, in my view, should be used to induce policy change. If you are willing to adopt policies that will make your citizens better off, I am willing to give you aid. If you are not willing to do that, I won't give you aid. But of course, my constituents won't be happy if at the margin I have not bought that trade concession or that intelligence or military-based concession. So democratic leaders, unless we, the people, tell them what we care about is helping poor people, not helping dictators, they will do what they are doing because that's what gets them reelected. So fundamental change in how aid is used, as opposed to what Donald Trump has done, which is simply to eliminate it, is the right response is to change how it's done. The party in power benefits from foreign aid in every donor country. We've demonstrated this empirically as well as theoretically. And the key is to use it to induce good outcomes. And unfortunately, that's not being done. And finally, as I intimated earlier, monitoring the conditions in governments that are doing a lousy job of producing peace and prosperity for their people, and seeing what nudges can be done to move them in a better direction is something that foreign policy makers should be monitoring and acting on all the time, because while the opportunities are always there, anytime there is a new leader in office, there is an opportunity to lock them into the reform that journalists think they're engaged in. Anytime a leader is believed to be in really bad health, there is a way to lock them in, to lock their country into changes that are short-term benefits for them and will be long-term harmful for leaders, but very beneficial for the people. So those are the things to be done. Some of them are unpleasant. As you know, don't forgive debt. Make the forgiveness contingent on performance. First perform, then we alleviate a piece of the debt. Perform some more, we alleviate some more of it. Not, yeah, we're going to give you the money now, and then you'll do good things later, because after you have the money, you have no reason to do good things later.
Professor Bruce, thank you for this fascinating exploration of how leaders anticipate and respond to threats that never materialize. Your insights on known events and the subtle signals that reshape governance remind us that the most consequential political changes often happen quietly in the decisions leaders make to avoid the crisis we never see. Anticipating instability offers a powerful framework for understanding not just what happens in politics, but what doesn't, and why that matters even more. For our listeners interested in diving deeper into game theory applications in political survival, policy change, and the paths societies take forward freedom or oppression, I highly recommended picking The Anticipating Instability from MIT Press. Thank you once again, Professor Bruce, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. This has been truly enlightening. Thank you so much.
Meherbani, shukriya, thank you. I very much appreciate your taking the time.